You've heard Atlantis was real. The texts don't support that, and tonight we're going to read what they actually say. Not memes, not maps, Plato's words. Here's the plan. I'll show you how Timaeus and Critias build a teaching story, why the search methods fail, and the one mistake that ruins every Atlantis hunt. You'll learn to spot the genre signals that scholars use. Stay as long as you like. You can drift off and still wake up smarter. There's a quiet, secret step in Plato's method that makes everything click. We'll reach it gently. Settle in. This is a calm, sleep-friendly deep dive with soft pacing, clear sections, and no hype. If you doze for a few minutes and rejoin later, you won't be lost. I'll mark transitions, repeat the thread briefly, and keep jargon to a minimum. Think of this as a guided walk through the text, not a chase. A few definitions up front so we share the same map. When I say myth, I don't mean false in a cheap way. In Plato, mythos is a story with ideas folded inside. Logos is reasoned account. He mixes them on purpose. Allegory is symbolism structured to point at concepts. When I say pedagogical device, I mean a teaching tool, a crafted narrative designed to train judgment, not to record navigation coordinates. Our method is simple. First, close reading. What do the dialogues themselves say? Who says it, and why in that scene? Second, scholarly consensus. How modern classicists read the genre signals, the dramatic framing, and the rhetoric. Third, claims. We'll test popular identifications only after the text and genre are clear. That order keeps us from forcing the story into a map-shaped mold. We'll pause at checkpoints. I'll note what we know, what we don't, and what would count as real evidence. Transitions will be flagged. Phrases like, before we continue, or now here's where most people mess up, will help you drop back in smoothly. Why this matters? Atlantis is often used as a shortcut to certainty, but in Plato, it's a mirror for ethics and politics. Reading it as a teaching story gives you a durable skill you can reuse on other ancient mysteries. If you remember nothing else, remember this guardrail. Read Plato as Plato before you read him as a travel diary. If you're ready, we'll meet the two dialogues where Atlantis lives. The first gives the frame. The second expands the story, and then stops mid-sentence. That unfinished edge is not a glitch. It's a clue. Plato delivers Atlantis through a pair of dialogues. Timaeus and Critias stage the day after the Republic's big conversation. The speakers are Socrates, the statesman Critias, the philosopher Timaeus of Locri, and the statesman Hermocrates. Socrates has just described an ideal city in conversation the previous day, and wants a living image of that city in action. This is the request that primes everything. Give me a story that shows the city's virtues tested in the world. The thing most people miss is that the Atlantis tale is offered to satisfy that pedagogical request. Critias steps in. He says he remembers a tale that Solon, the famous Athenian lawgiver, brought back from Egypt, taught to him by priests who claimed to keep very old records. The Egyptians reportedly told Solon that Athens was ancient and noble, and that long before any known wars, Athens repelled an imperial power from beyond the pillars of Heracles. Atlantis. Already you can hear the layers. Socrates asks for a model story. Critias claims a family memory. Solon hears from priests. Distance and authority stack to create a story within a story. And that layered telling is part of the point. It invites you to listen as a learner, not a surveyor. Timaeus then takes the floor for most of the first dialogue. He delivers a cosmology, a likely story, as he calls it, about the origin of the universe, the world soul, and the elements. Atlantis appears in Timaeus as a prelude anchored in Critias's promise. There was once a time when Athens embodied measure and a virtue, and Atlantis embodied wealth and excess. The moral framing is clear. A model city meets a hubristic empire. Timaeus doesn't give the long Atlantis narrative. He sets the metaphysical stage. The take-home in Timaeus is genre. Philosophical myth is being used to illustrate order, proportion, and fittingness. Critias, the second dialogue, is where the Atlantis story expands, but it's famously unfinished. It begins by recounting Solon's Egyptian source, then describes Atlantis in luxuriant detail, its divine genealogy from Poseidon, the island's concentric rings of land and water, the allotments to 10 kings, the abundance of metals, and orichalcum gleaming everywhere. The scales are extraordinary. The distances and the channels are mathematically tidy. The laws are strict at first, then softened as abundance tempts the rulers. This arc matters because it mirrors Plato's city-soul analogy. Order tends to decay when appetite swells and measure is forgotten. The setting devices are not random. Solon's presence in the frame borrows the credibility of a revered lawgiver. Egypt functions as the keeper of memory, a literary trope Greeks often used for antiquity and stability. These are signals of a crafted narrative aiming to teach through distance. When you're reminded that the events were 9,000 years before Solon, you're being invited to relax your historical literalism and focus on the moral geometry. It's not that Plato is careless with numbers, it's that he uses scale to push you into the realm of principle. Now, about that unfinished ending. Critias moves steadily toward the climactic confrontation, Athens versus Atlantis, then breaks off. The last surviving lines gesture toward an impending disaster brought about by moral decline, couched as earthquakes and floods. We never get the battle. The absence is conspicuous. It points you back to the pedagogical function Socrates set at the start. The city's virtues are the lesson, not the military spectacle. There's a secret step here. Plato makes you do the final inference yourself. By withholding the big screen payoff, he keeps your attention on the contrast between measure and excess. A few practical points will keep you oriented. First, track who is speaking and why. When Critias claims an old family memory via Solon and the priests, he's building rhetorical distance, which reduces petty quibbles and invites reflection. Second, mark the hyperbole. Oversized islands, perfect rings, metals in improbable abundance. These exaggerations are not careless mistakes. They are genre markers, like bright flags that say, read for meaning. Third, notice that Athens is idealized as archaic, not the familiar classical city. Plato isn't doing a documentary of Mycenaean or Minoan history. He's staging an ethical exemplar. Once you view Timaeus and Critias as a paired teaching device, cosmology to set order, political myth to test it, the whole Atlantis debate looks different. The question stops being, where is the island, and becomes, what did this story train listeners to see? That reframing aligns with how modern classicists treat the dialogues, as literary constructions that use myth to sharpen philosophical insight. We'll test that reading against popular identifications later, but starting here, inside the text, is the cleanest route. The dialogues themselves tell you how to listen, and that is the calm, reliable ground we'll stand on. Before we continue, you need to understand why Plato reaches for myth at all. If you skip this, you'll keep trying to squeeze travel data out of a teaching story. And that's where every Atlantis hunt drifts off course. The stakes are simple. Treat a philosophical myth like a field report and you miss the lesson. Treat it like a crafted device and you gain a skill you can reuse everywhere in Plato and beyond. The thing most people miss is that myth, for Plato, isn't the opposite of reason. It's reason wrapped in a narrative coat that helps listeners picture order, measure, and consequence. When Plato says likely story in Timaeus, he's not apologizing. He's setting expectations. Some terrain can't be nailed down with demonstration alone, so he uses a plausible, morally charged story to guide your eye. The benefit is clarity. The risk is literalism. Myth keeps people listening, but it also tempts them to grab the imagery and run past the point. Here's the shortcut nobody teaches. Plato uses myth when he wants you to practice judgment, not just memorize conclusions. The Atlantis episode gives a moral geometry, measure versus excess, mapped onto a city and an empire. He could lecture you on moderation. Instead, he lets you feel it through contrast. The reason this works is that stories travel faster than proofs. You remember a city that restrains appetite and another that gorges on it. When the floor collapses for Atlantis, the effect lands without a footnote. Now, what exactly is this device? Think of it in 3 layers. First, a frame that sets the purpose. Socrates asks for a living image of the ideal city. That's your why. Second, a credible chain of transmission. Solon, Egypt, to suspend nitpicking about dates and pull you toward the principle. That's the what, a story dressed with authority so you'll entertain it. Third, a controlled escalation. Abundance, temptation, drift from law, and the coded natural consequence. That's the how. Narrative movement that matches ethical logic. The game changer nobody talks about is genre boundaries. Plato signals when he's doing strict argument and when he's in the likely story lane. In Timaeus, he labels the cosmology a likely account. In Critias, he adorns the city with mythic features, divine parentage, hyperbolic metals, concentric rings that warn you away from literal mapping. If you remember nothing else, remember this checkpoint. When divine founders, outsized scales, and moral contrast stack up, you're in pedagogy, not cartography. Let me show you exactly how the educational payoff works. Suppose a listener believes political excellence is just power plus wealth. The Atlantis myth hands them a shiny empire with both, and then shows it bending toward ruin as measure thins out. Meanwhile, archaic Athens, spare and disciplined, holds firm. The lesson is sticky because it's embodied. You don't need a lecture on moderation. You've watched a city succeed by it, and another fail without it. Now here's where most people mess up. They think the vivid details are proof of reportage. Actually, the details are hooks to make the principle memorable. Orichalcum gleaming everywhere, canals measured just so, bulls at the altar. Each element builds a world you can hold in your head. The precision isn't there to pass a geographer's audit. It's there to seal the moral contrast. That doesn't make it deceitful. It makes it didactic. You might be thinking, couldn't Plato have just said, be moderate and moved on? He could, but he knows people learn by seeing a form in motion. The likely story is a moving diagram. It's like a geometry proof built with characters instead of triangles. Once you accept that, the urge to find satellite matches fades, and a more useful urge replaces it, to ask what behavior the story rewards or warns. There's also a humility embedded in this method. By using myth, Plato admits that some truths are grasped as images first. He doesn't surrender reason, he stages it, and because he leaves Critias unfinished, he nudges you to finish the inference yourself. That secret step, making you supply the last move, locks the lesson in place. You don't just hear it, you practice it, so the better method is clear. Read the Atlantis tale as a deliberate teaching device designed to train your judgment about cities and souls. Implementation is simple. Track the frame, register the genre signals, and ask what habit the story builds. The result is practical. You stop chasing coordinates and start noticing character, law, and measure. Exactly the things Plato wants front and center. Now, with the tool in hand, let's look closely at how he sets the pieces in Timaeus. Let's slow the text down and watch how the setup works inside Timaeus. We're still at the same table as yesterday's Republic conversation. Socrates wants a living image of the ideal city in action, not just on paper. That's the ignition key. He's asking for a story that puts virtues under stress. Critias offers to supply one tonight for us, by recalling a tale Solon heard in Egypt. That promise is the bridge from abstract politics to narrative pedagogy. Now, the first move in Timaeus is subtle. Before any Atlantis details, Socrates confirms the kind of picture he wants, an account of a city facing great dangers and meeting them with measured courage. This calibration matters. It frames what counts as relevant detail later. We're not collecting place names. We're collecting tests of character. The city should be shown as brave because it obeys law and reason, not because it finds a clever harbor. Then Timaeus takes over with cosmology. That can feel like a detour, but it's a deliberate primer. He calls his account a likely story, signaling that we're in a mode where images and proportion guide understanding. He lays out a universe built with measure, harmony, and fitting relations. Why put this before Atlantis? Because the political story is going to echo that same architecture. Order holds when parts serve the whole, and it fails when appetite leads. The cosmos as ordered diagram prepares your ear for the city as ordered diagram. When Critias resumes briefly in this dialogue, he sets the hook. Long ago, Athens was ancient and excellent, and Atlantis was a mighty power beyond the pillars of Heracles. The Egyptians told Solon that Athens stood firm while Atlantis overreached. Hear the alignment with Socrates' request. Not just any war, but a moral contrast dramatized by conflict. The function is clear. We're being set up to watch measure, defend itself against excess. Let's track the credibility chain. Socrates wants a model. Critias claims a family memory. Solon hears from priests said to keep old records. Each step adds distance. That distance is doing two jobs. It dampens the urge to quibble about minor specifics, and it lends weight to the moral claim. This isn't a fresh anecdote, it's an old lesson. The thing most people miss is that the chain's length is a genre cue, not an archival boast. We also get scale hints right away. The time span, 9,000 years before Solon, is thrown like a long rope into the past. The place, beyond the pillars, pushes the scene to the edges of Greek experience. These are not navigational coordinates. They're rhetorical spacemakers. They move you out of familiar streets and into a mythic field where principles can stand tall without being mistaken for reportage. Now here's where most people mess up. They seize those numbers and try to reconcile them with archaeology. But in Timaeus, Plato is calibrating your expectations. The cosmology is a likely account, the political tale, is a living image. Both lanes are signposted as instructional, not documentary. If you remember nothing else from this reading, remember the pairing. Ordered cosmos, ordered city, likely story, teaching myth. Let me show you exactly how the setup points forward. Socrates' appetite for a model city under pressure, combined with Timaeus' harmony-first universe, commits the narrative to a moral geometry. When Critias says Athens was temperate and Atlantis became swollen with wealth, you already know the shape of the conflict. Lawfulness versus luxury, proportional courage versus inflated desire. The reason this works is that it stops you from asking where and starts you asking, what kind of action counts as virtuous here? A micro-story helps. I once watched a student read Timaeus like a menu of facts, dates, distances, seaways. They missed Socrates' request entirely. Once they circled living image and likely story, the noise dropped away. Suddenly, Critias' borrowed authority felt like an on-ramp to reflection, not a bibliography to verify. Their notes shifted from how big was the island to what tests reveal a city's soul. One last cue. Even in Timaeus' brief mentions, Atlantis is framed as rich in resources and coordination, with channels and rings that sound engineered to perfection. That tidy geometry isn't a map, it's an emblem. Perfect circles, precise measures, metal abundance. These are visual metaphors for ordered power drifting into ornament. The pattern prepares you for Critias to expand those features and then bend them toward failure. So by the time Timaeus closes, the table is set. We have the purpose, the tone, the genre signals, and the moral compass. Once you nail that, everything else clicks. The next dialogue will add detail, but the template is already stamped. Measure held, excess punished, and a listener trained to see the difference. Now we're inside Critias, where the camera zooms in and the details multiply. The dialogue opens by restating the chain: Solon, Egypt, family memory, and then moves straight into Atlantis' origin. Poseidon is said to have sired 10 sons with Plato, dividing the island into 10 allotments. Right away, mythic genealogy takes the wheel. Divine founders aren't archaeological breadcrumbs, they're genre signals. The purpose is to code the city's character from birth, power drawn from a god of seas and shocks, bound, at first, by law. Critias lingers on the island's architecture. 3 rings of water and 2 of land surrounding a central hill, cut by channels measured to the stadion, bridged with gates and crowned by a citadel. It's geometric, almost schematic, as if a diagram were turned into a city. This is where most people mess up. They treat the circles as a blueprint you could overlay on satellite maps. Inside the dialogue, the rings function as a symbol of order, concentric control radiating from a sacred center. The image is memorable because it's neat. The neatness is didactic, not documentary. Then come the allotments, laws, and metals. The 10 kings rule their districts under a common code inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum. There's a ritual detail. Bulls are hunted, sacrificed, and the kings swear to uphold the laws. Orichalcum glitters through the description, second only to gold in value. A listener tuned to genre hears abundance and magnetism. The city gleams, the law shines. The point is moral contrast in material form, wealth that can either reflect order or distort it. The inventory grows, harbors lined with ships, walls sheathed in metals, purple dye, hot and cold springs, and a landscape that yields everything in wonderful plenty. The hyperbole stacks intentionally. It creates temptation pressure. Think of Plato's city soul analogy, from the Republic humming underneath. When appetite sees endless supply, does reason stay in charge? Critias makes you watch that balance tilt. Growth into empire follows. Atlantis extends power over many islands and reaches into parts of the mainland. The narrative arc bends from law to expansion, from self-measure to appetite stretching its limbs. Athens, in contrast, is sketched as harsh in soil but rich in virtue. Trained citizens, simple gear, firm law. The contrast feels engineered because it is. We're supposed to see two trajectories, one toward proportionate excellence, the other toward splendid excess. Earthquakes and floods appear as coded catastrophe, not as a seismologist's report. The language ties natural upheaval to moral failure. As the kings forget their common laws, as their divine portion thins and the mortal part swells, the ground itself turns against them. It's a narrative rhyme with a simple theorem. Cities fail from the inside first, and the world's shocks finish what character started. The reason this lands is that the disaster matches the ethical diagnosis. A quiet but crucial moment is the inspection by the god. In Critias, the divine assembly sees Atlantis losing its measure. The punishment is not thunderbolts rendered in spectacle. The text moves toward judgment and then breaks off. That sudden cutoff isn't a production error, it's a nudge. Plato refuses to give you the cinematic finale. He leaves the confrontation with Athens unshown, which forces you to hold the principle instead of the parade. That's the secret step at work again. You complete the proof. Common mistakes cluster here. One is reading orichalcum and bulls as signals of specific Bronze Age cultures. Another is treating the stadia measurements as cartographic precision. In a teaching myth, specificity serves memory. The numbers are glue, not GPS. Another mistake is ignoring the moral sequencing. The text doesn't say, they had wealth, therefore they were good. It says, they had wealth. At first they obeyed measure, then wealth swelled, then measure thinned, then collapse. Reverse that, and you lose the plot. Let me give you a quick application you can try. Take one paragraph from Critias, say, the laws on the orichalcum pillar, and annotate it with 3 colors. One for genre signals, divine founders, rituals. One for abundance markers, metals, springs, ships. One for moral cues, oaths, shared law. When you step back, you'll see a pattern that reads like a moral diagram wearing world-building clothes. That's the function. Why this matters is simple. If you accept Critias as a crafted exemplar, the debate about coordinates gets quieter, and the useful question gets louder. What habits does the story reward? The answer is steady. Common law over personal appetite. Proportion over display. Memory of origin over drift into ornament. The unfinished ending keeps you in that space. You're not an expedition leader. You're a student finishing a lesson. So when you hear concentric rings, think ordered center. When you hear 10 kings, think unity under law. When you hear orichalcum, think shiny test. And when the dialogue stops, let the silence do its work. It points you back to the opening ask. Give me a living image of the city's virtue under pressure. Critias delivers the setup, sketches the drift, and leaves you with the inference Plato wanted you to practice. Before we wander into maps and mysteries, let's ground ourselves in how professional classicists read these dialogues. The short version. Atlantis is a literary construction inside a philosophical project, not a report of a lost continent. That doesn't mean anything goes. It means the strongest evidence sits inside the text, its speakers, framing, genre signals, and in how Plato uses myth elsewhere. Start with the consensus shape. Most classicists treat the Atlantis episode as a philosophical myth, sometimes called a likely story, built to test political ideas. It's aligned with the way Plato deploys the myth of in the Republic or the cave allegory. Vivid images that carry ethical load. The cues they emphasize are the same ones we traced. Socrates' explicit request for a living image, the mythic genealogy, the hyperbolic abundance, and the carefully staged moral arc from law to drift to ruin. When those cues pile up, scholars read pedagogy, not geography. There are shades within that agreement. Some scholars stress allegory, Atlantis as a mirror of the city soul, where the human tendency to let appetite outgrow reason plays out at civic scale. Others emphasize political pedagogy. The story dramatizes what happens when a constitution loses shared measure. Still, others fold it into Plato's broader metaphysics. The ordered cosmos in Timaeus is echoed by the ordered city tested in Critias. So the narrative's job is to make proportion visible. Different accents, same tune, a constructed myth with a didactic aim. What about the so-called external evidence? Here, scholarly method gets stricter. Classicists don't begin by scanning satellite images. They start with genre and intertext. They compare how Plato frames stories, how Greek literature uses Egypt as a memory trope, how divine founders function in mythic histories, and how hyperbole signals a shift from report to exemplar. Only after the literary scaffolding is clear do they ask whether any historical kernel is plausible. And even then, the kernel is treated as motif level. Familiar flood tales, imperial rise and fall patterns, not as coordinates you can plot. Disagreements exist, but they sit inside these boundaries. One camp reads more modeling into the tale, suggesting Plato may have borrowed textures from known cultures, trade wealth, naval power, without intending a one-to-one portrait. Another camp leans toward near-total invention under a traditional mythic umbrella. Neither camp argues for a real island empire beyond the pillars as Plato's source. The distance markers, the 9,000-year span, and the divine genealogy are read as genre choices, not as datable claims. A key reason scholars resist literalizing the tale is Plato's own signaling. In Timaeus, he labels the cosmology a likely story, a cue of epistemic humility. In Critias, he ramps up mythic markers, Poseidon's sons, orichalcum pillars, concentric rings that in Greek narrative practice belong to paradigmatic stories, not archives. Add the unfinished ending, and the odds tilt further. An author who withholds the climactic battle is steering attention toward the lesson, not the spectacle. That's consistent with Platonic pedagogy. Another anchor is comparison across dialogues. The myth of uses precise numbers, journeys, and mechanisms of the afterlife. But no serious scholar takes it as travel journalism of the soul. Its specificity serves memory. The cave's layout is carefully described, but no one hunts for its mouth in Attica. By that standard, the rings of Atlantis work the same way. The more exact the picture, the more portable the principle. Classicists spot that pattern and read accordingly. There's also the methodological reminder about burden of proof. Extraordinary historical claims need strong, independent, contemporaneous evidence. Atlantis, as described, would leave broad traces, texts, inscriptions, material culture across multiple societies. We don't have that. What we do have is a single literary source inside a philosophical dialogue that telegraphs its teaching intent. Scholars weigh that and file Atlantis with moral exemplar rather than with Herodotean ethnography. You might wonder about older, ancient readers. Early receptions don't show organized searches for a sunken continent. They show literary interest and philosophical use. That historical afterlife fits the scholarly read. People recognize the story meant to instruct, not a dispatch. If you remember nothing else from this section, remember the evidence order. Classicists start with Plato's framing, genre signals, and intertextual parallels. They build an interpretation that explains why the details look the way they do. Only then do they test whether any external correlation adds value. When a proposed match demands that we rewrite Plato's cues, shrink the timeline, move the ocean, discard the divine frame, it's methodologically weak. Read Plato as Plato before you read him as a map legend. So the takeaway is calm and firm. Modern scholarship doesn't deny that myths can carry hints of human experience. It insists that in this case, the text itself points to a pedagogical myth designed to train ethical vision. Once that baseline is set, we can fairly test the popular identifications people love to promote. And we will, gently, starting with the most famous geological candidate. Let's start with the most reasonable sounding claim. Atlantis was really the Minoan civilization on Crete, and the Santorini Thera eruption was the catastrophe Plato dressed up. It's attractive because it blends a real Bronze Age culture with a real disaster. The problem is simple. The fit breaks at every point that matters to the dialogues, and you have to rewrite Plato to make it work. First, the timeline mismatch. In Timaeus and Critias, the priest tells Solon the events occurred 9,000 years before his time. Even if we grant a rounding or a storyteller's exaggeration, the Thera eruption sits around the mid-2nd millennium BCE, while Solon is 6th century BCE. That's a gap of about 1,000 years, not 9. To salvage the hypothesis, people say maybe Plato meant months, or Egyptian years were lunar, but the dialogues don't hint at a translation error. Inside the frame, the long span is doing rhetorical work. It pushes the tale into the mythic past to teach principles, not to offer a datable chronicle. Second, the geography mismatch. Plato puts Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles, a Greek label for the straits at Gibraltar, with the Atlantic Ocean beyond. Thera is in the Aegean, well inside the Mediterranean, and well inside familiar Greek sailing waters. Some argue that beyond the pillars can be stretched metaphorically, or that the story garbled locations. But the point of that boundary in the narrative is distance, moral and spatial. Moving Atlantis back into the Aegean erases the dramatic horizon Plato chose. Third, the structural mismatch. The Minoan caldera is impressive, but Plato's Atlantis is a flat island with concentric rings of land and water engineered by canals, bridged and measured to neat stadia. The caldera is a volcanic bowl with irregular rims and submerged walls. Dramatic geology, but nothing like the symmetrical urban diagram Critias describes. To make Thera fit, you have to ignore the engineering scheme and call the rings kind of like a caldera. That swap drops a key genre signal. Plato's circles are an emblem of order, not a fingerprint of volcanism. Fourth, the cultural frame. In the dialogues, archaic Athens is the moral counterweight, law, measure, train citizens, against a wealthy imperial Atlantis. The Minoans were a distinct Bronze Age culture with palatial centers, vivid art, and maritime reach. But the Athens of that time wasn't the disciplined exemplar Plato sketches. If Plato meant Minoans, he would have to recast Athens as a Mycenaean power with features we recognize archaeologically. He doesn't. He draws a deliberately archaic, idealized Athens to serve the lesson. That's a sign of pedagogy, not hidden reportage. There's also the genre contradiction. The Santorini hypothesis leans on physical correlates, ash, tsunamis, collapse, to map onto Plato's earthquakes and floods. But in Critias, natural upheaval is coded as moral consequence. Wealth swells, law thins, the divine portion fades, and then the earth answers. It's not geology for its own sake. It's ethical weather. Plugging in Thera as the cause narrows the story to disaster mechanics and strips the moral scaffold that Plato builds into the arc. A quick guardrail helps. Ask, can the Santorini claim stand without rewriting Plato's distances, compressing his timeline by an order of magnitude, and swapping his symbolic engineering for volcanic topography? If not, it fails the genre first test. The more a theory depends on Plato got the numbers wrong, or he really meant the Aegean, the weaker it is as a reading of these dialogues. Now, a fair question. Could Plato have borrowed textures from real seafaring cultures? Possibly. He could have known of rich island powers, trade networks, and palace economies in vague outline through inherited stories. But texture is an identity. The dialogues don't ask you to identify a specific Bronze Age polity. They ask you to compare two forms of civic character under pressure. That's the thing most people miss when they chase Thera. They reduce a moral diagram to a search image. Here's a calm micro-story. A student once brought me a glossy book overlaying Thera's caldera on Critias rings. The circles looked close enough to be persuasive at 10 p.m. Under a bright lamp, the differences popped. Missing harbors, wrong scale, no canals, no inland plain the size Plato describes. The aha moment was quiet. Oh, the circles are telling me about order, not giving me a map. If you remember nothing else from this section, remember the shortcut. When a match requires you to discard Plato's own genre signals, divine founders, hyperbolic scales, didactic framing, it's not a match. Read the text first, then test the world. On that order, the Santorini-Minoan hypothesis is instructive for a different reason. It shows how a plausible geology can still miss the point when you treat a pedagogical myth like a field report, from plausible geology to seductive imagery. This is the claim that grabs people by the eyes. The Risha structure, the so-called Eye of the Sahara in Mauritania, looks like a bullseye from space. Wide, concentric rings etched into the desert. If you've got Plato's circles floating in your head, it's an instant click. And that click is the problem. This is a mirage built from visual pareidolia, our brain's habit of finding a pattern it wants to see, then explaining it after the fact. Let's start calmly with what Risha is. Geologists classify it as a deeply eroded, uplifted dome, a circular anticline where layers of rock, harder and softer, weather at different rates over millions of years. That differential erosion exposes rings. There's no engineered canal system, no harbors, no city buried under sand. It's landform, not architecture, and crucially, it sits about 400 meters above sea level, far inland on a plateau. Plato's Atlantis is an island beyond the Pillars of Heracles, surrounded by ocean, with ships, docks, and channels cut to the sea. Richer fails the water test on the first pass. Scale compounds the mismatch. The Richer structure spans roughly 40 kilometers across. Plato's Atlantis includes a central island, rings, and importantly, an adjacent broad plain with canals laid out in a grid of stadia. large enough to sustain a major population and military force. At Richard, there's no evidence of large-scale irrigation channels, no traces of ports, no metal-sheathed walls, no orichalcum pillars. The materials Plato highlights, metals in abundance, especially the poetic orichalcum, don't appear here as cultural artifacts. What you have is sandstone, volcanic rocks, and sedimentary layers eroded into circles. Now here's where most people mess up. They start with the satellite photo, see the rings, and then go hunting in the text to make it fit. That inversion flips our method on its head. If you read Plato first, genre signals, dramatic frame, moral arc, you see the circles as a symbol of order, not as a survey. Then, when you look at Richard, the resemblance collapses into coincidence. The reason this pattern chasing is so sticky is that pareidolia rewards the quick hit. It looks right, therefore, it is right. But teaching myths resist quick hits on purpose. Consider the geography. Plato's narrative needs an island in the Atlantic, reachable by sea, projecting power across islands and coastal regions. The Sahara Plateau is not that. To salvage the theory, promoters suggest the Sahara was wetter in the deep past. True in certain periods, but wetter doesn't move a 400-meter plateau down to sea level or conjure a missing coastline at the right time. And even if climate allowed lakes and rivers nearby, the dialogues emphasize maritime infrastructure, ships in channels, a royal harbor, and a strait to the ocean. Richard offers none of that. There's also the cultural silence. A city of the scale Plato describes, paired with a vast plain and canals, would leave signatures, artifacts, architecture, inscriptions, at least scattered traces across neighboring regions. We don't have that. Instead, Richard yields what you'd expect from a remote, arid region with intermittent human presence, stone tools from various periods, small sites, no imperial footprint. The burden of proof lies with the extraordinary claim. Without independent evidence, the eye remains a geological curiosity, not a lost capital. Let me show you exactly how to apply the genre-first guardrail. Ask 3 questions. Does the site match the textual geography without special pleading? Do materials, infrastructure, and scale align with the narrative specifics? And most important, does the identification preserve Plato's moral architecture? Divine genealogy, lawful beginnings, drift into excess, coded catastrophe. Richard fails the first 2 outright. On the third, it offers nothing. The moral arc can't ride on a rock dome. A quiet microstory. A viewer wrote saying, but the rings are perfect. Under a loop, they aren't. They're irregular, broken, with spurs and gaps. That imperfection is normal for erosion and a red flag for anyone hoping for engineered canals. In Cretias, the rings are bridged with gates and passages measured to neat stadia. An engineer's diagram inside a teaching story. At Richard, you'd have to carve the canals into hard rock, leave no debris trail, and somehow erase harbors. The cleanup crew would be more miraculous than Atlantis. The game changer nobody talks about is dates versus narrative function. Richard's formation is deep time geology. Plato's catastrophe is moral timing. When law thins, collapse follows. There's no reason to sink an anticline's erosion with a civic fall. When the cause of resemblance is, my eyes like circles, and the cost is throwing out every other cue Plato gives, the method is upside down. If you remember nothing else from Richard, remember this shortcut. When a claim starts with a picture and works backward to the text, you're likely in pareidolia, not scholarship. Read Plato as Plato, then check the world. On that order, The Eye of the Sahara is a mirage for Atlantis hunters and a neat geology lesson for everyone else. Last stop on our gentle tour of popular claims, Bimini Road. Off North Bimini in the Bahamas, divers found long, straight-edge slabs underwater that look like paving stones laid in neat lines. It's photogenic and close to shore. It feels like something a lost civilization would build. The calm truth from geology is simpler. It's beach rock, natural limestone that forms along coastlines, broken and aligned by ordinary processes. Let's start with what beach rock is. In tropical shallows, waves wash sand and shell fragments back and forth above the water table. Minerals in seawater act like cement, binding the grains into a slab just below or at the shoreline. Over time, these slabs fracture along joints and bedding planes, snapping into rectangles that look suspiciously like cut blocks. Then currents and storms slide and rotate them, producing rows that mimic human masonry. No quarries, no Bronze Age engineers, just chemistry, pressure, and wave energy doing slow, tidy work. Now here's where most people mess up. They see straight edges, sharp corners, and repeating shapes and assume design. But regularity can be a signature of fracture, not craftsmanship. Beach rock breaks along parallel lines because the stress fields and bedding layers are consistent. If you walk a modern beach with recent beach rock, you'll see the same geometry forming in real time. Divers at Bimini photographed joints, not chisel marks, bedding planes, not mortar seams. The reason this fools us is simple. Our brains love grids. Let me show you exactly how the dating undercuts the myth. Radiocarbon and other methods on shells and carbonate cements from Bimini Road point to the Holocene, thousands of years old at most, often within the last few millennia, forming when sea levels were near their current positions. Plato's story, even if you tried to map it, would require deep antiquity relative to the classical world and a very different cultural context. A Roman era or later shoreline slab doesn't rescue Atlantis. It tells you the ocean does patient, repeatable work. Consider the layout. Proponents talk about a paved road, but the formation sits parallel to the present shoreline, like many beach rock benches worldwide. Roads don't drift into alignment with wave-cut terraces. Beach rock does. The blocks vary in thickness, tilt at natural angles, and sometimes overlap like shingles, a classic depositional pattern. Where you'd expect architectural features, cornerstones, tool marks, foundation trenches, you find rounded edges and biological incrustations that grew while the slabs lay in the surf. That's not how engineered causeways age. It's how coastal rock lives. You might be thinking, what about the gaps that look like joints? Joints in beach rock are joints. Cracks, where the cemented layer broke. They can look like seams because sand infills them, and algae line the edges, making the lines crisp underwater. The test is tactile. Tool-cut faces show consistent striations or peck marks. Fractured faces show granular breakage that follows the class matrix. Divers and geologists who examine the slabs up close report natural fracture textures. No chisels, no wedges, no Lewis holes for lifting. A quick micro-story, a friend who dives. Bimini took a straight edge and a curiosity, not a theory. They found blocks that looked perfect from 3 meters away. Up close, the right angles were breezy illusions, the corners rounded, the surfaces pitted by dissolution, shell fragments intact inside. The aha was quiet. Nature fakes symmetry just enough to tempt impatient eyes. Scale and context matter too. Plato's Atlantis asks for harbors, walls, metals, canals, and a huge plain, an infrastructure web. Bimini Road is a single coastal bench with no associated architecture, no foundations inland, no harbour works attached, no cultural debris layer, no ceramics, no tools embedded where you'd expect activity. Extraordinary construction claims need a neighbourhood of evidence. Here, the neighbourhood is coral, sand, and younger beach rock elsewhere along the Bahamian platform. The game changer nobody talks about is formation environment. Beach rock forms at or near the intertidal zone, locking in at today's or recent sea levels. It's not a sunken street dragged down from a vanished island. It's a shoreline layer that stayed put while sea level shifted modestly. Its very existence argues against a catastrophic drop and drown narrative in that spot. If you remember nothing else, remember the shortcut. Apply genre first to the text, then process first to the rock. Critics of Bimini Road don't hate mystery. They respect mechanisms. When a natural process, well documented, observable today, produces the exact features on display, you don't need an empire to explain rectangles. You need waves, calcium carbonate, time, and a mind willing to let a calm answer be enough. Before we continue, it helps to ask why Atlantis grips us at all. Understanding the pull makes you less likely to fall for weak claims and more likely to use the story the way Plato intended, as training for judgment. The stakes are real. If you know why your brain wants Atlantis to be out there, you can slow down, breathe, and read better. Start with narrative cravings. We like golden ages because they promise a clean origin, a time when things fit. We like moral decline because it organizes frustration. If the past was better, today's mess has a cause. And we love sudden endings because they deliver closure. Atlantis compresses that arc, rise, excess, fall. It scratches an itch for a tidy shape in history. Plato uses that appetite on purpose, but not to sell coordinates. He uses it to spotlight measure and excess. Now, cognitive biases. Availability bias makes recent, vivid content feel truer. You see a striking image of the Rishat rings or a drone shot of Bimini slabs, and because it's vivid, it feels likely. Confirmation bias follows. If you already want Atlantis to be real, every neat circle becomes a port, and every straight edge becomes a ramp. Motivated reasoning then assembles a case from the conclusion backward. None of this makes someone foolish. It makes them human. Knowing these habits lets you create guardrails. Pareidolia deserves its own calm line. Your visual system hunts patterns even in noise. It's a life-saving feature in the wild and a mislead when you're reading myth. Concentric geology and blocky beach rock are perfect bait. The thing most people miss is that Plato's images are designed to be pattern-rich. He wants the rings and metals and canals to stick. The trick is to let them stick as symbols, not as survey markers. Authority borrowing is another hook. Plato's frame leans on Solon and Egyptian priests. Modern claims swap in new priests, satellite analysts, divers, influencers, or whistleblowers. The tone is similar, a promise of access to older memory or hidden knowledge. The reason this works is social proof. When a confident voice says, "This matches exactly," doubt tires fast. A simple counter is to ask, matches what exactly, and in what genre? There's also the appeal of the underdog discovery. People love the idea that official scholars missed something obvious. It feels democratic to outsmart an institution from your couch. But expertise in classics is less about guarding secrets and more about learning to read forms, frames, speakers, genre. The better story isn't they hid Atlantis, it's they notice signals you can learn too. That shift turns curiosity into a skill rather than a contest. Let me show you exactly how the story functions as a mirror. If a listener craves spectacle, Atlantis offers gleam, orichalcum, walls, harbors. If a listener craves order, Athens offers measure, law, training, restraint. Your reaction to each says more about your values than about any island. That's Plato's quiet move. He uses a vanished world to surface present habits. The reason this works is that self-recognition sticks longer than a debunk. A micro-story to anchor this. Last month, someone wrote, "I want Atlantis to be real because the world feels empty without mystery." That's honest. The kindly answer isn't stop wanting that, it's move the mystery. There's wonder in the way myths teach, in the way numbers and images build memory, in the way a dialogue can leave blank space for your judgment. The mystery becomes how ideas shape us, not where an island sits. Another bias is the sunk cost feeling. Once you've watched hours of videos or bought books, it's hard to step back. Your brain says, don't waste it. Find a link. The guardrail is gentle. It's not wasted if it taught you how persuasion works. Every almost is a lesson in method. Plato would approve. He wants you to notice when appetite, the appetite for certainty, for spectacle, starts to steer the soul. There's a comfort in grand explanations too. A lost continent that seeded civilizations ties loose threads. But big, simple answers rarely fit messy evidence. Plato's answer is smaller and stronger. Cities and souls thrive by measure and fail by excess. That scales to any era. You don't need a submarine to use it. You need attention. If you remember nothing else from this section, remember this shortcut. When your excitement spikes, slow down and ask what the story is rewarding in you. Speed, certainty, spectacle, or patience, proportion, and care. The first set makes you easy to sell to. The second set makes you hard to fool. So here's the practical guardrail. Before you chase a claim, ask, what lesson does this version of Atlantis incentivize? If it pushes you to prize wealth and power as signs of truth, you're off Plato's path. If it nudges you to value shared law, moderation, and clear method, you're closer. That's the psychology in service of reading well. With that in mind, let's reconstruct the lesson Plato wanted on the table. A calm geometry of order and excess that you can apply to cities, to yourself, and to every shiny mystery that floats by. Now let's lay the moral diagram on the table. Plato draws two shapes for you, measure and excess. Measure means proportion, parts fitting the whole, appetite under law, strength guided by reason. Excess is mismeasure, parts swelling beyond their place, appetite taking the driver's seat, ornament outrunning purpose. Atlantis and archaic Athens are built as mirrors for these shapes, so you can see character at civic scale without a lecture. Start with measure and proportion as civic virtues. In Timaeus, the cosmos is ordered by number and harmony. In Critias, Athens reflects that order in law, training, and shared discipline. Citizens are raised to prefer the common rule over personal show. The thing most people miss is that measure is not austerity for its own sake. It's fitness, the right tool for the job, the right appetite at the right time, courage tuned to what the situation calls for. A measured city doesn't hate wealth or power, it refuses to be steered by them. Now turn the lens to excess. Atlantis is drawn with dazzling abundance, metals everywhere, walls sheathed in glitter, hot and cold springs, purple dyes, fleets. None of this is evil on its own. The danger comes when supply swells desire, and desire starts redefining what counts as enough. Laws that once bound the 10 kings lose bite. Oaths become rituals without grip. Plato's quiet claim is that excess is a geometry problem. One part expands until it distorts the whole. The city wobbles because its center of gravity shifts from law to appetite. The reason this matters is that political life always asks the same question. Which part rules? In the Republic, the just soul puts reason in charge, spirited courage as its ally, appetite as a well-fed follower. The city is the soul, writ large. In Critias, that analogy hums under every detail. Athens keeps reason, law, and measure on the throne. Atlantis lets appetite magnified by wealth grow confident and then forgetful. The divine portion thins, as Critias puts it, meaning rational and measure recede. The mortal appetitive part swells. Collapse isn't random. It's a theorem. Let me show you exactly how the narrative encodes this. Concentric rings around a sacred center signal order radiating outward. Center first, circumference second. Harbor works and canals can serve common needs if the center holds. But as the kings soften, the bright metals and measured passages start to read as display. The image flips. What began as a diagram of order becomes a mirror of mismeasure. The lesson sticks because you feel the tilt before the fall arrives. A micro-story helps. A reader once asked, "Isn't excess just having a lot?" Not quite. Excess is when a lot changes the purpose of the parts. A city can have ships to secure trade and defense. If ships turn into the city's identity, policy starts orbiting prestige and other goods, education, justice, shrink. You haven't added, you've unbalanced. Plato's trick is to let you watch that substitution happen in Atlantis without scolding you. This is where natural disaster enters as moral consequence. Earthquakes and floods don't come as random meteorology. They rhyme with the ethical diagnosis. When measure thins, the ground itself feels loose in the story. That's narrative logic, not geology. The payoff is that your attention stays on causes you can govern, law, training, appetite, rather than on whether you can't. It educates agency. If you remember nothing else, remember this checkpoint. Measure is a relation, not a number. It's fittingness. A modest city can be immoderate if pride rules. A wealthy city can be measured if wealth serves law. Plato's geometry asks one test. Does the center govern? In Athens, yes. In Atlantis, no. Now the application. Read your own context with the same diagram. In teams, ask which part rules, mission, metrics, or mood. In personal habits, ask whether appetite sets the schedule or reason does. The thing most people miss is that excess often arrives as efficiency or reward. A dashboard that helps can become the point. A tool that speeds work can start dictating which work you choose. The drift is quiet. Plato's story trains you to feel it. There's also a practical guardrail for civic life. When display starts out shouting purpose, glossy projects over durable institutions, you can expect Atlantis-like symptoms, softened oaths, rules bent for convenience, shared stories replaced by personal brands. The fix isn't hair-shirt austerity. It's a return to center. Rebuild the shared measure. Rehearse the reasons for the rules. Feed appetite, but don't seat it on the council. A final calm note on orichalcum and shine. Plato makes splendor sticky on purpose, so the contrast lands. Don't resent the gleam. Read it. If a bright thing draws you, ask what it's for. If the answer starts circling the bright thing itself, you've found excess. If it points back to a common good under law, you've found measure. That's the moral geometry in one sentence. Let the center rule the circumference. Before we push further, Let's make the reading easier by naming the genre signals Plato plants like trail markers. When these flags stack up, they're telling you to read for meaning first. Start with mythic genealogy and divine founders. In Critias, Poseidon fathers the first kings with Cleito. That's not a historical claim that a census could verify. It's a literary move. Divine origin codes character. A sea god founding a maritime power cues you to expect strength, mobility, and eventually volatility. The divine ingredient also sets up the later diagnosis. As the divine portion thins, the mortal part swells. That rise and fade dynamic is a core Platonic rhythm, and genealogy makes it visible from the first line of the city's biography. Next, hyperbolic scales and idealized resources. The island's rings are perfectly measured. Metals gleam in layers. The plain is vast and neatly cut by canals. In Greek prose, that kind of polish is a signal of an emblem, not a survey. Perfect circles, exact stadia, abundant orichalcum. These are mnemonic devices. They make the image stick so the moral contrast lands. If you find yourself treating round numbers as GPS coordinates, step back. In Plato, precision often serves pedagogy. Add the didactic framing to provide a model. Socrates asks for a living image that will test a city's virtue. Critias offers a tale suited to that ask. That upfront purpose is a genre declaration. It tells you what kind of truth you're meant to extract. You're not being asked to verify harbors. You're being asked to watch how law holds under pressure. When an author states the teaching goal and then feeds you a story, treat every shiny detail as part of the lesson plan. Now, the unfinished text and conspicuous narrative symmetry. Critias advances toward judgment, sketches the moral slippage, invokes divine inspection, and then stops. That asymmetry in plot becomes symmetry in function. The arc completes without spectacle, order, drift, consequence. In other words, the lesson's shape is intact, even if the battle scene is missing. An incomplete narrative that still completes its moral geometry is a Platonic tell. You'll also hear likely story markers in Plato's style. In Timaeus, he admits the cosmology is a likely account, framing a zone where images guide understanding. When that label appears anywhere near your target tale, treat it as a soft border between strict demonstration and instructive narrative. It's not a license to believe anything. It's a nudge to weigh plausibility and function over literal mapping. The genre shifts. The standard of proof shifts. The payoff stays philosophical. There's a structural signal too. Story within a story layering. Socrates wants a model. Critias recalls a family memory. Solon hears priests cite old records. Each layer adds distance and authority while lowering the heat of debate. You don't haggle over a date on a tale told as very ancient. You consider the point it's making. Stack that with Egypt as memory, a familiar Greek trope for venerable antiquity, and you're squarely in the land of exemplar. Stories crafted to carry principles, the shortcut worth memorizing. Whenever genre flags stack, divine founders, hyperbolic plenty, explicit pedagogy, likely story framing, layered transmission, conspicuous incompletion, don't literalize. Ask what habit the story is training. If you remember nothing else, remember that question. It rescues you from pareidolia and recenters you on Plato's purpose. Let me show you exactly how to apply this in practice. Take any Atlantis paragraph. Circle divine or ritual language in one color. Underline measurements and metals in another. Box the moral cues, oaths, laws, talk of measure, or the divine portion. If divine and hyperbolic cues outnumber concrete logistics, don't reach for a map. Reach for an ethical inference. If the moral cues explain why the logistics matter, keep them. If not, treat the logistics as memory glue, not evidence. Now here's where most people mess up. They spot one flag, say precise stadia, and treat it as a warrant for cartography, ignoring the 5 other flags shouting teaching myth. Single signal reading is how Atlantis hunts get traction. Multi-signal reading is how you stay anchored. The reason this works is that Plato designs redundancy. If you miss one cue, 2 more are waiting. A calm micro-story to lock it in. A colleague once taught Critias by handing out a checklist of genre signals. Students marked 15 in 3 pages. By mid-seminar, the Richard and Santorini slides they'd brought felt off-key. Not because geology is boring, but because the text had declared its aims. The aha wasn't loud. Oh, these details are instructive, not investigative. That's the kind of quiet clarity that keeps you from drifting into speculation and lets you rest in the purpose the author gave you. Let's widen the lens. Atlantis makes the most sense when you place it next to Plato's other teaching myths. He repeats a pattern. Precise, memorable imagery, carrying ethical work. Once you see that toolkit, Atlantis stops pretending to be a map and settles into its real job. Start with the myth of air at the end of the Republic. Plato gives you a soldier who dies, visits the afterlife, watches souls choose new lives, and returns to report. The machinery is intricate, spindle of necessity, lots, demons, cycles. No classicist treats it as a travel diary of the dead. Its precision serves memory, so you'll carry the principle home. Your choices habituate the soul. Justice pays off across a longer arc than a single life. The lesson lands because the images stick. That's the same move we've seen, specificity as pedagogy. Shift to the cave allegory. Again, exactness without coordinates. A cave, prisoners, shadows, a fire, a rough ascent, and the sun. Every piece is placed with care, but not to invite spelunking. The cave's layout maps the stages of education, opinion, struggle, turning toward what is, and the duty to return. If you remember nothing else, remember how the detail works, not as geology, but as a diagram of the mind. Atlantis's rings, stadia, metals are the civic version of that diagram, a moral map for political character. Now Phaedrus and the chariot myth. Plato sets the soul as a charioteer with 2 horses, one noble, one unruly. The images are vivid: feathers, reins, strain, the circuit of the heavens, designed to make the dynamics of desire and discipline visible. Nobody hunts for the racetrack. They read the balance of parts. That's the same city soul analogy humming beneath Critias. When the unruly horse, appetite, pulls too hard, the team veers. When reason and spirited courage align, the path holds. Back to Timaeus for the likely story about the cosmos. He lays out a world soul, geometric solids, a craftsman god shaping order from chaos. It's technical and careful, yet framed as a likely account, an admission that images help when demonstration runs out. The thing most people miss is the humility in that label. It isn't license for fantasy. It's a cue about genre and aim. The cosmology trains your sense for proportion, so you can recognize it again at the political scale. Atlantis slots naturally under that umbrella. A likely story about civic order and its loss. Consider the statesman's myth of the cosmic reversal. Plato tells of an age when the universe turned the other way. God shepherded life directly, and later the world was left to run on its own. It reads like a fable with time cycles, not a calendar event. Its function is to frame governance, what it means to guide a community when direct oversight is gone. The moral is practical. The myth is a vehicle. Atlantis uses the same vehicle, pointing to how rule changes when wealth swells and memory fades. Even the laws includes Athenian Cretan, founding tales that are frankly didactic, blending plausible institutions with mythic coloring to teach why certain civic practices matter. Plato isn't hiding sources, he's staging comprehension. He consistently ties moral claims to memorable story shapes. Let me show you exactly how this context clarifies Atlantis. In each myth, you see three moves: a clear teaching aim, a sticky image system, and internal cues that this isn't reportage. There's lots of numbers, the cave's architecture, the chariot's parts, the likely cosmology, all keep your mind busy, so the principle lodges. Critias fits that spine. Aim gives Socrates a living image of virtue on trial. Images, rings, metals, laws, cues, divine founders, hyperbole, unfinished end, same method, different subject. A calm micro-story seals it. In seminar, we read first, then the cave, then Critias. Students marked where details served the lesson. By the time we reached Atlantis, the urge to grab a map had cooled. One said, "Oh, it's the cave for cities." That's the aha worth keeping. When Atlantis stands beside Plato's other myths, the genre signals stop being confusing and start feeling familiar. So, use the pattern. When Plato gives you exactness, ask what it's teaching to remember. When he layers authority and distance, ask what heat he's lowering so the principle can breathe. Atlantis, seen in this company, is a steady tool, a crafted myth about measure and excess, not a breadcrumb trail to a drowned empire. Let's turn to the frame that makes the story feel ancient and solid: Solon and the Egyptian priests. This is where many listeners lean in and say, records. But inside Plato's craft, this frame is rhetoric doing teaching work, not a pipeline to an archive you can audit. Why invoke Solon? In Athens, Solon is a byword for wise lawmaking and measured reform. Borrowing his name lends credibility to a moral tale about city order. If the story came through a gossip, you'd brace for noise. If it comes through Solon, you brace for law and memory. The point isn't to prove a document exists. It's to tune your ear towards civic virtue before the story even starts. Egypt plays the foil of memory. In Greek literature, Egypt often stands for age, continuity, and stable record-keeping. The priests claim Greeks are like children, forgetting cycles of destruction, suits the lesson's stakes. It clears space for a very ancient Athens and an empire beyond the familiar sea. Again, this isn't a travel permit to Sais. It's a narrative move that lowers argument heat so principle can breathe. You stop haggling over dates and start listening for measure and excess. Notice the layering tactic. Socrates asks for a model. Critias cites a family tradition. The tradition points to Solon. Solon points to priests. Priests point to old inscriptions. Each layer increases distance and authority in the same stroke. Distance slows the impulse to litigate specifics. Authority invites you to weigh the moral contrast. In a courtroom, this would be hearsay. In a pedagogical myth, it's genre scaffolding. The thing most people miss is that the chain's persuasive force is literary, not evidentiary. Story within a story also creates a safe zone. If Critias said, "I saw this," you'd be tempted to cross-examine. Solon heard this shifts you into parable mode. The lesson can land without derailing into quarrels over whether a scribe in Sais kept ledgers for 9,000 years. Plato knows audiences. He knows how to move you from prove it to what is it proving. That pivot is the whole point. There's a reason no independent coeval source corroborates this tale. We don't have Egyptian records naming Atlantis, Athens' prehistoric war, or 10 kings under Poseidon. That absence isn't a gotcha. It's a guardrail. When a single literary source contains every thread and signals its didactic aim, scholarship reads genre, not journalism. The Solon Egypt frame buys narrative authority for pedagogy. It doesn't rent you a research desk in an actual temple archive. You might ask, why not think there's a lost papyrus? Because method matters. Extraordinary claims require independent, contemporary evidence. If Atlantis, as described, had confronted an archaic Athens from the Atlantic, echoes would appear. Names, loanwords, trade traces, multiple traditions. We don't see that. We see Plato doing what he often does, staging a dialogue that uses venerable voices to carry instruction. The weight lies in the function those voices serve. Let me show you exactly how to read the frame without losing its value. Treat Solon as a moral color, not a footnote. It shades the story toward law and measured reform. Treat Egyptian priests as a signal of antiquity and memory, not as a citation to be tracked down. When you do that, the frame becomes a tool. It primes your expectations for a lesson about stability versus drift, shared law versus swelling appetite. Common mistakes gather here. One is assuming that naming a credible figure turns a myth into history. Another is inflating old records into modern archives with searchable shelves. A third is using the frame to launder anachronisms. If Egypt kept it, any number can be true. Plato isn't outsourcing fact-checking to Sais. He's outsourcing tone, calm, old, measured, to voices his audience already respected. So the moral geometry arrives wrapped in gravitas, a small microstory. A student once insisted, but Solon wouldn't lie. Right, he wouldn't. But Plato isn't asking him to lie. He's asking him to lend ethos to a teaching setup. The tale's truth is in its function. Solon's integrity guarantees the sincerity of the lesson, not the cartography of a vanished island. Once that clicked, the student stopped chasing papyri and started tracking how law, memory, and measure interact across the frame. If you remember nothing else, remember this guardrail. Absence of external, contemporaneous corroboration plus thick genre signaling equals stay in pedagogy. The Solon Egypt frame is brilliant rhetoric. It slows you down, raises respect, and invites you to practice the skill Plato cares about, reading stories by what they train, not by what they tempt you to hunt. Let's walk through the calm, greatest hits of pro-Atlantis replies and test them with the genre-first method we've practiced. The goal isn't to score points, it's to keep the reading clean. First, all myths hide kernels of history. Sometimes, flood stories echo real inundations. Migration tales can compress memories of movement. But sometimes isn't a method. You test the kernel claim by asking what the story is doing. When a text stacks signals, divine, genealogy, hyperbolic abundance, didactic framing, layered transmission, conspicuous incompletion, you're not being nudged to extract coordinates, you're being pointed toward a principle. If you peel off a kernel by discarding the genre cues, you're not discovering history. You're ignoring the function of the myth. Second, Plato describes advanced technology, so he must be reporting. This usually leans on orichalcum, big fleets, and engineered canals. Read it in context. Metals gleam as moral tests. Fleets show capacity and temptation. canals render order as a diagram. None require anachronistic tech. Orichalcum is a poetic prestige metal in Greek thought, not a sci-fi alloy. The measurements are tidy because memory loves symmetry. The thing most people miss is that specificity in Plato often serves pedagogy. He wants you to remember proportions, not reverse engineer machines. Third, ancient maps show Atlantis. Most cited specimens are early modern fantasies, misread marginalia, or outright forgeries reused for clicks. Even genuine medieval maps repeat classical lore without independent evidence. The text we have is Plato. One literary source with heavy didactic signals outweighs later cartographic echoes that trace back to the same source. If a map adds nothing not already in Critias and Timaeus, it isn't corroboration, it's illustration. Fourth, sea levels rose, floods happen. Therefore, Atlantis. Yes, sea levels changed after the last glacial maximum. Yes, local catastrophes hit coasts, but generic catastrophe is a broad brush. Plato's use of earthquakes and floods is moral coding, collapse, following drift from measure, not a seismology note. If your argument is disasters exist, so this disaster must be that disaster, you're reasoning from a category to a coordinate. The dialogues push you to focus on cause within character, not to equate any inundation with a narrative finale. Fifth, the timeline is a translation error. Egyptian years were months. This rescue move compresses 9,000 into manageable centuries. The text offers no such hint. Inside the frame, the large number buys mythic antiquity to serve the lesson. Shrinking it because it's inconvenient for a pet theory inverts method. If a claim survives only by rewriting the author's chosen scale, it's weak. Ask why Plato needed vast time to shift you from fact-checking to principle weighing. Undo that, and you undo the pedagogy. Sixth, maybe Plato used a real island empire as a base, then embellished. Possible at the texture level, trade wealth, naval reach, palatial opulence can echo realities. But inspired by is. The burden is to show which external evidence matches without flattening genre signals. If your best case requires moving Atlantis into the Aegean, renaming beyond the pillars, swapping concentric canals for a caldera, and reassigning Athens' role, you've left inspired by and entered substitution. Texture is allowed, identity is unearned. Seventh, but multiple sources mention Atlantis. In practice, they mention Plato, or sources that mention readers of Plato. That's not independent attestation. It's a citation chain. Independence requires a contemporary, unrelated tradition that preserves names, places, or features in ways that don't derive from the dialogues. We don't have that. We have Plato's crafted myth and later echoes of his craft. Eighth, archaeology is always surprising. Keep an open mind. True, openness isn't credulity. The guardrail is proportionate evidence. A claim about an ocean-spanning empire with engineered rings, vast plains, and imperial wars needs a neighborhood of material culture, inscriptions, architecture, art, trade residues, loanwords. Surprise doesn't erase standards. It heightens them when the claim is extraordinary. Openness plus method keeps you curious and sane. Ninth, dismissing Atlantis is academic gatekeeping. Reading the dialogues as teaching myths isn't a power move, it's a text move. The genre signals are there for any reader. The methods, track speakers, way framing, compare myths are learnable. The most empowering answer is not trust experts, but use the same tools. When you do, the literalist readings feel cramped because they can't carry what the story is built to carry. 10th, Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, right in general. Wrong as a shield against proportion. For small, fragile traces, absence can be ambiguous. For a massive, long-lived empire with engineering feats, absence across texts and layers, combined with a single source that tells you its teaching, becomes evidential. It tilts the scale toward genre, not toward a hidden continent. Let me give you a simple, practical test you can use on any counter-argument. Strip it to 3 questions. Does it preserve Plato's framing and genre signals? Can it stand without compressing timelines, moving oceans, or reassigning roles? And does it add independent evidence rather than recycling the dialogues through new media? If you get 3 no's, you've got rhetoric trying to outrun the text. A calm micro-story. Someone wrote, but what if even one detail is historical? Good. Treat that as a motif. Wealthy island powers exist. Disasters happen. Empires overreach. Those truths are useful when they lead you back to Plato's point. Measure and excess, rather than out to speculative maps. The counter-arguments don't fail because curiosity is bad. They fail because they trade a working lesson for a weaker chase. Let's turn method into habit. Reading Atlantis like a classicist means flipping the usual order. Text first, world second. You start inside the dialogue, track how it speaks, and only then ask external questions. Here's a calm, repeatable way to do it. Begin with the Greek text, or a reliable translation, and note genre cues out loud as you go. Ask who's speaking, to whom, and for what purpose. Socrates requests a living image to test a city. That's your North Star. Any detail that doesn't serve that request is probably memory glue, not a map. When Critias invokes Solon and the priests, label the move, authority borrowing and time distance framing. You're setting the stage, not opening an archive. Now, track the dramatic setting. Dialogues are plays with arguments inside them. Mark the stakes the character's name. Measure, law, virtue, drift. When those words cluster near measurements and metals, underline the proximity. Classicists watch how moral language and bright detail travel together. That pairing signals pedagogy. Specifics that stick so the principle can ride along. Next, mark hyperbole and stock motifs. Perfect circles, vast plains, abundant metals. 10 kings under a god. These are literary amplifiers. In Greek prose, hyperbole often flags exemplar. Write exemplar mode in the margin when abundance and symmetry appear. It reminds you that precision may serve memory, not surveying. Then cross-check with Plato's other myths. Keep a short mental deck. For ethical consequences across time. The cave for education via image. The chariot for soul dynamics. The Timaeus likely story for epistemic humility. Ask, does Atlantis use the same toolkit? Clear aim, sticky images, genre signals. If yes, default to pedagogical reading unless independent evidence yanks you out of it. So far, none does. Only after you've built that internal scaffold do you ask external questions. Could any motif reflect known realities? Trade wealth, naval reach, disasters, maybe, but phrase the search as motif, not identity. What real features echo these themes? Avoids the trap of turning rings into rings you must find. If an external candidate demands compressing 9,000 years into 900, moving the Atlantic into the Aegean, or stripping the divine frame, you've inverted the burden. The text's genre wins unless strong. Independent data forces a rethink. Let me show you exactly how to practice on a paragraph. Take the passage describing the concentric rings. Step 1. Identify speaker and purpose. Critias answering Socrates' request for a model. Step 2. Flag moral terms nearby, oaths, laws, division among 10 kings. Step 3. Mark the measurements, stadia, ring widths and metals, orichalcum, brass, tin. Step 4. Label, genre cues, divine founders, abundance, symmetry. Step 5. Extract the lesson in one sentence. Order radiating from a sacred center can decay when oaths thin and appetite grows. Now test. Do you need a map to use that? No. The moral works without coordinates. A quick exercise you can try tonight. Pick any Atlantis paragraph and annotate 3 colors. Blue for divine or ritual language, red for numbers and materials, green for explicit moral signals. If green explains why blue and red matter, you're in pedagogy. If red tries to carry the meaning alone, you're drifting toward literalism. That color balance keeps you honest when images tempt you. Here's where most people mess up. They start with nouns as artifacts. Orichalcum must be an alloy we can recover. Stadia must be GPS. Rings must be aerial photos. Flip it. Ask first what each noun does for the argument. Orichalcum test values. Do you prize shine over law? Stadia make the diagram memorable. Can you carry proportion in your head? Rings visualize centered order. Can a city keep its core ruling its edges? When nouns do moral work, treat them as instruments, not relics. There's also a healthy skepticism about silence. A city of that scale, if historical, would echo broadly. Inscriptions, art, loanwords, neighbors' tales, they'd pile up. We have Plato alone, signaling pedagogy. Classicists weigh absence alongside genre. It tilts the reading toward mythic instruction, unless contradicted by strong contemporary evidence. That standard isn't gatekeeping, it's proportion. Finally, adopt a 2 guardrail test for every claim you meet online. Guardrail 1, genre preservation. Does the claim keep divine genealogy, didactic framing, hyperbole, and likely story humility intact, or does it sand them off to make room for coordinates? Guardrail 2, independence. Does the claim add evidence not sourced from Plato, datable artifacts, independent texts, or just remix his details with new visuals? If either guardrail fails, pause. Your curiosity deserves a method that helps you sleep. If you remember nothing else, remember this reading order: frame, function, image, comparison, then correlation. It's slow, calm, and it works. Let's practice together on a short slice from Critias. I'll paraphrase to keep it sleep-friendly. Poseidon, finding the island large and fair, settled with Clito on a hill. He encircled it with rings of sea and land, 2 of land and 3 of sea, each at measured distances, and bridged them. He divided the island among 10 sons, binding them by laws and oaths to rule justly and to aid one another. And they honored the god with offerings, especially of orichalcum, which then was most valued after gold. Step 1. Name the speaker and purpose. This is Critias answering Socrates' request for a living image that can test a city's virtue. Note that purpose aloud. It keeps you from drifting into cartography. Every shiny detail you're about to mark serves the model Socrates asked for. Step 2. Flag the moral cues. Hear laws, oaths, rule justly, aid one another, and honored the god. These are green lights in our earlier exercise. They reveal the ethical spine: order under law, reciprocal obligation, piety anchoring power. If you feel your eyes slide toward measurements, steer back here first. The moral language tells you why the measurements matter. Step 3. Underline the numbers and architecture. 2 of land and 3 of sea. Measured distances, bridged. These are the red marks, memory devices. The rings are not coordinates. They're a diagram you can picture at 3 a.m., so the idea of centered order sticks. The bridges convert separation into governed connection. The thing most people miss is that these logistics dramatize a political truth. Good law turns natural divisions into cooperative paths. Step 4. Circle the divine and ritual signals. Poseidon, honored the god. Orichalcum offerings. That's your blue ink. Divine genealogy codes the nature of the regime. Maritime strength with a sacred center. Offerings show the initial posture. Appetite under a higher measure. The divine portion is thick here. Later, when Critias says it thins, you'll feel the contrast. Step 5. Extract the one-sentence lesson. Try this. A well-ordered community centers its power around a sacred measure, links its parts by law, binds leaders by oaths, and prospers without letting wealth outrun purpose. If you can say that, you can carry the passage's point without a map. Now apply the genre checklist quickly. Do we have divine founders? Yes. Hyperbolic symmetry and abundance? Yes. The neat rings, prize metals, didactic framing? We're still inside Socrates' model experiment. Layered transmission? Yes. Critias, Solon, priests? Conspicuous precision? Absolutely. When 4 or more flags light up, default to pedagogy. You can still ask external questions later, but you won't be hijacked by them. Let me show you exactly how a common misread happens on this paragraph. Someone starts with 2 of land and 3 of sea, opens a satellite app and hunts circles. That flips the order. Red before green. Image before function. Flip it back. Start with the oaths and laws. What are they doing? Binding kings. What do bridges do? Bind rings. The physical mirrors the ethical. That mirroring is the point. A calm micro-exercise you can do now. Whisper 3 verbs from the passage, encircled, bridged, divided. Then pair them with 3 civic verbs, constrain, connect, allocate. Feel how they map. The geography performs politics. Poseidon encircles, constraint. He bridges, connection. He divides among sons, allocation with rules. If later the oaths loosen, the bridges will feel like decor, not discipline. The collapse will read as the failure of those verbs, not as a random wave. Check for memory glue versus message. Orichalcum is sticky. It shines in your mind. Ask, what does it teach? At first, value aligned with piety. Later, when appetite swells, the same metal will tempt. The noun's job is to test your values, not to tease metallurgy. If a claim about mysterious alloys doesn't change the moral, it's optional. Let's do a quick now you try. Pick one clause, binding them by laws and oaths to rule justly and to aid one another. Mark it green. Now ask which red and blue details support it. Bridges, red, enable aid. Poseidon, blue, grounds the oaths. If a future theory strips bridges or the god from the reading, your green clause loses its scaffolding. That's how genre preservation becomes your guardrail. Finally, a sleepy summary to pocket. Read the passage as a civic diagram. Center first, ring second, oaths first, stadia second. If you remember nothing else, remember the pairing. Bridges as laws, rings as parts, center as measure. That pairing will keep you from chasing circles and help you practice the habit Plato designed this image to train. Let's zoom out and watch how this teaching myth wandered. The journey matters because each step away from the dialogues adds layers of spectacle and trims the genre cues we've been tracking. Seeing that drift helps you keep your footing. Early receptions treated Atlantis as literature. Plato students and later Greek and Roman readers cited the tale for its moral contrast or its imaginative power, not as a field report. Philosophers mined the civic lesson. Rhetoricians used the imagery. You don't see ancient fleets mounting expeditions to the Atlantic based on Critias. The story lived on as an ethical example, which is exactly the job Plato gave it. As classical learning filtered through late antiquity and the medieval period, the story's outlines survived in summaries and references, often second-hand. Commentators kept its moral coloring, pairing it with other exemplar about rise and hubris. The text's authority was literary and philosophical, not cartographic. When myth traveled, it traveled as meaning. The early modern era shifted the tone. As Europe's oceans opened and travel romances bloomed, writers borrowed Atlantis as a flexible stage. Utopian works repurposed it as a thought experiment about ideal societies. Francis Bacon's New Atlantis wasn't an attempt to find Plato's island. It was a laboratory for imagining institutions, science, and virtue. The reuse is telling. Atlantis was a blank slate for teaching, still doing pedagogical work, just in a new key. Then came the 19th century's taste for grand, speculative systems. Occult and theosophical writers recast Atlantis as a primordial cradle for root races and hidden wisdom. Here the drift accelerates. The Solon Egypt frame gets inflated into secret lineages. Plato's moral geometry gets replaced with esoteric maps and timelines. The source remains Plato, but the genre flips. What was a tool for ethical clarity becomes a canvas for mystical history. The details multiply while the dialogue's internal aim fades. In the 20th century, fringe archaeology and sensational media amplified the spectacle. Popular books promised coordinates, continents, and catastrophes. TV specials turned ambiguous geology into plot points. The method flipped exactly as we warned. Pictures first, text second. The eye of the Sahara becomes a set piece. Beach rock becomes a road. 9,000 years becomes negotiable. The more the story traveled, the less Plato's framing survived. Meanwhile, classicists kept reading the dialogues with the same tools we've used. Genre, speakers, dramatic frame, intertext with other myths. Those didn't change. The gap widened between scholarly reading and popular chasing. That gap wasn't snobbery. It was method. The Academy's calm answer stayed steady. Literary construction, philosophical purpose, pedagogical myth. The internet era sped up everything. Satellite imagery, drone footage, algorithmic feeds, each gives pareidolia new fuel. A striking ring gets millions of views. The comments supply Solon and priests as fresh authority. The citation chain tightens into an echo chamber. Videos cite videos that cite blogs that cite a line in Critias without context. The emotional payoff is quick. The method is thin. It's easy to forget that one ancient source sits beneath the pile. There's also a marketing layer. Atlantis sells documentaries, novels, games, tourist excursions. Incentives favor certainty over nuance. A thumbnail screaming "found outperforms," "let's read Plato well." That pressure nudges creators to round off genre flags and to promise reveals. If you felt tugged by that energy, you're not alone. The way platforms reward speed and confidence makes careful reading feel slow. The antidote is the same guardrail you've practiced. Frame first, function first. A quiet micro-story from seminar. We pulled up a viral thread claiming an exact match between a desert formation and the rings. Students mapped our genre checklist onto the screenshots. Divine founders missing, didactic frame absent, likely story humility gone, layered transmission ignored, precision treated as GPS. By the end, the thread read like a game of telephone where each retelling dropped a cue that would have saved the reader time. The aha wasn't cynicism. It was relief. The text still held. So what do you do with the afterlives? Use them as exercises. Each retelling invites you to practice the skill Plato wanted. Distinguish image from principle, appetite from measure. When a new claim appears, ask what changes in your reading if it's true. If the moral geometry doesn't sharpen, the claim is entertainment. There's nothing wrong with entertainment, as long as you don't mistake it for evidence. If you remember nothing else from this tour, remember the curve. Plato's myth as pedagogy, early echoes as exemplar, early moderns as utopian thought experiments, occult systems as speculative history, mass media as spectacle, internet culture as pareidolia on tap. At each bend, the genre signals thinned. Your job is simple. Thicken them back up before you believe anything with rings. Let's bring it home calmly. Plato didn't hand you Atlantis to start a scavenger hunt. He handed you a gym. The exercise isn't rowing a boat. It's training your judgment. Here's the workout he built into the story. First, discern image from principle. Every ring, metal, and measurement is an image that points to a principle. The discipline is to ask, before the images grip you, what work they do for the argument. If the image teaches a value, center before circumference, law before shine, hold it. If it tempts you into coordinates with no change to your character, let it pass. You practice that separation every time you read a myth and resist the map. Second, test stories by their function and payoff. Plato stages the function in the opening ask, a model to test a city's virtue. The payoff is whether you leave with a clearer sense of measure and excess. When a theory keeps the function intact and strengthens the payoff, it earns attention. When it weakens the function by trimming genre cues or shrinks the payoff into spectacle, you've learned to say no. That's not being closed-minded. That's keeping the assignment in view. Third, value civic measure over spectacle. Atlantis dazzles on purpose so you can feel the tug and practice saying, what's the point? Athens reads plain in comparison. And that's the test. Can you prefer the quiet strength of oaths kept over the thrill of walls gleaming? In your own civic life, that translates to preferring durable institutions over flashy projects, process over announcement, shared law over personal brand. Fourth, use myths to train ethical attention. The cave, the chariot, the likely cosmology, all of them are attention trainers. Atlantis is the civic version. It sharpens your eye for the moment appetite starts to steer. You learn to notice when praise shifts from function to shine, when measures get negotiated into decor, when oaths soften into slogans. That's the kind of attention that prevents drift long before disaster has a chance to rhyme. If you remember nothing else, remember this line. Atlantis is a mirror lesson. It reflects your habits back at you. If you crave speed and spectacle, you'll read it as a chase. If you prize proportion and patience, you'll read it as a guide. The same text tests two readers differently. The difference is the reader's training. Let me show you exactly how to turn that into a daily habit. When you meet a new claim, ancient mystery, breaking news, shiny metric, do a 30-second genre check. Who's speaking? What's their frame? What's being rewarded? Certainty or inquiry? Spectacle or structure? Then do a 30-second payoff check. If the claim is true, what changes in how you act? If nothing ethical sharpens, it's probably entertainment. Enjoy it as such and keep your method. A micro story, A listener wrote that after learning this lens, they stopped arguing with a relative about Riche and started asking, "What do you want this to be true for?" The answer, to feel like the world is still meaningful, opened a door. They moved the conversation to meaning as practice, reading well, building communities with measure, finding mystery in clarity. The chase lost heat. The feeling stayed, just anchored to something you can actually do. There's also a practice for teams. In a meeting, name the center out loud, the mission, then name the rings, departments, projects, metrics. Bridge them with explicit oaths, agreements about how you'll help one another. When a bright new tool or metric arrives, ask which ring it sits in and whether it serves the center. If it tries to become the center, you've spotted excess early. That's Atlantis used properly, a diagram that keeps you measured. One more guardrail for news literacy. When a headline promises a found continent, translate it through Plato. Is this an image or a principle? Most will be images. If you're awake and curious, share the principle instead. The method, the patience, the standards. That doesn't kill wonder. It relocates it to places that last. A gentle closing exercise you can try when you're drifting off. Pick a bright detail from the day. An ad, a headline, a metric, a gadget. Whisper 3 questions. What's the center? What do the rings serve? Are the bridges strong? If your answers come back scrambled, center missing, rings ruling, bridges for show, you've found a little Atlantis moment. The fix is simple. Recenter, rebind, remeasure. That's the practice Plato wanted. Calm discernment, steady proportion, and stories used as tools to keep your judgment awake even when your eyes are heavy. Was any part of Atlantis historical? Pieces of texture could echo real life, wealthy islands, naval power, floods. But the tale itself in Plato is a teaching myth. Treat motifs as familiar realities and the plot as a crafted lesson. You don't need a vanished continent for the message to work. Why are the details so precise if it's a myth? Precision is memory glue. Rings, stadia, metals, these make the moral diagram sticky. Plato does this in other myths too. The cave's layout, ears, numbers, specifics help you carry the principle home, not pack a suitcase for a dig. Could a sunken city exist somewhere else? Sure, the sea holds ruins, ports, towns, shipwrecks, but a sunken site exists isn't Plato's Atlantis exists. Keep categories straight. Local submergence is archaeology. Atlantis in Plato is a city soul mirror built to teach measure and excess. What about Santorini and the Minoans? Impressive eruption, rich culture, serious impact on the Aegean. The mismatch is genre and text. Plato's timeline, location beyond the pillars, concentric plan, and moral framing don't fit the late Bronze Age Aegean. For Santorini's story, read geology and Aegean history. For Atlantis, read Plato's pedagogy. Could 9,000 years mean months? The text doesn't say so. That move is a rescue device built outside the dialogue. Inside the frame, the vast number buys mythic antiquity that cools debate and focuses you on principle. If your theory works only after shrinking Plato's time, it's the theory that needs shrinking. Is orichalcum a lost supermetal? In Greek, thought it's a prestigious, legendary material, valuable after gold, sometimes linked to brass. In Critias, it signals wealth and shine, then tests values. If you can swap in any shiny thing and the lesson stays the same, the noun was doing moral work, not tech. Do any ancient sources confirm Atlantis independently? No contemporary unrelated text lists the 10 kings, the war with very ancient Athens, or the island beyond the pillars with concentric rings. Later mentions mostly repackaged Plato. One literary source with heavy genre signals is strong evidence of intent, not of geography. Why did Plato use Solon and Egypt, if not as citations? To borrow ethos and age. Solon sounds like law and measure. Egypt sounds like memory and stability. That framing lowers argument heat and raises attention to the moral geometry. It's rhetoric serving pedagogy, not archival breadcrumbs. What about maps that show Atlantis? Most are early modern fantasies, misread glosses, or decorative cartouches. Even honest medieval maps transmit classical lore. If a map adds nothing independent of Plato's details, it illustrates rather than corroborates. Could earthquakes and floods be literal? In story logic, they rhyme with moral collapse. Plato codes disaster as consequence when measure thins. Real earthquakes exist. In the dialogues, the point is agency. You can govern laws and appetites. You can't govern waves. Read the wave as a verdict, not as seismology. Are scholars just being closed? The method is open and teachable. Track speakers and aims. Weigh genre cues. Compare Plato's myths. Then ask external questions. If strong, independent evidence ever appeared, readings would adjust. Until then, genre first keeps thinking clear. Should I stop looking? Don't stop looking. Change what you're looking for. Hunt the lesson. Use the myth as a tool to practice discernment. If you enjoy geology, read geology for geology. If you enjoy classics, read the text for what it trains. Curiosity doesn't have to chase coordinates to stay curious. What's a quick way to test a new claim? 2 guardrails. Guardrail 1, genre preservation. Does the claim keep Plato's framing, divine genealogy, likely story tone, and moral aim? Guardrail 2, independence. Does it add evidence not sourced from Plato? If either fails, pause. Your attention is worth standards. Why does this gentle approach matter? Because it leaves you with a skill you can use everywhere. Separating images that sell from principles that hold. That's calming. It makes you harder to fool and easier to teach, which is exactly the kind of rest Plato's dialogues were written to give. If your mind wandered, here's the soft focus version you can hold with one hand. Atlantis, in Plato, isn't a lost continent. It's a crafted teaching story. He builds it inside a dialogue where Socrates asks for a living model to test a city's virtue. That request sets the assignment. Watch how law, measure, and appetite behave under pressure. Everything shiny serves that lesson. The genre cues were loud if you knew how to listen. Divine founders and mythic genealogy, the Poseidon line, signal you're an exemplar, not journalism. Hyperbolic exactness, the rings, stadia, metals, works as memory glue so the principle sticks. The layered transmission, Critias to Solon to priests, adds authority and distance, cooling debate so the moral geometry can breathe. The likely story tone from Timaeus keeps your standard tuned to pedagogy. And the unfinished Critias. The arc still closes. Order, drift, consequence. The moral diagram is simple. Measure means parts fitting the whole. Appetite under law. Courage allied with reason. Excess is mismeasure. Part swelling. Shine steering purpose. Oath softening into ceremony. Athens is the model of measure. Atlantis is the mirror of excess. Earthquakes and floods rhyme with that drift. They're narrative verdicts, not geology notes. The city is the soul, writ large. Scholars read it this way because the text demands it. They weigh internal signals over external hunts. They compare Atlantis to Plato's other teaching myths. The cave, the myth of the chariot, the likely cosmology, and see the same toolkit exact images carrying ethical work. One literary source with thick didactic framing outweighs later maps and montages. Popular matches don't pass the method test. Santorini compresses time, moves seas, and flips the moral frame. The Riche structure starts with satellite circles, then forces details. Bimini Road is beach rock dressed as blocks. Each requires rewriting Plato or ignoring genre flags. When a claim survives only by trimming the dialogue, it's the claim that's too small. The Solon and Egypt frame isn't a passport to an archive. It's rhetoric that borrows ethos and age to prepare you for a lesson about measure versus drift. No independent contemporary sources corroborate Atlantis as described. That absence, plus the genre stack, guides you gently back to pedagogy. The reading habit is calm and repeatable. Start with speakers and purpose. Mark moral language near bright details. Treat numbers and metals as instruments for memory. Cross-check with Plato's other myths. Only then ask external questions, phrased as motifs, not coordinates. Use 2 guardrails on every new claim. Preserve genre. Demand independent evidence. Why this helps? It turns curiosity into a skill. You stop chasing rings and start training attention. You learn to ask which part rules, reason, spirit, or appetite, at home, at work, in news, in teams. You notice when display outshouts purpose, when tools become centers, when oaths thin into slogans. You can fix those. You can't fix waves. If you remember nothing else, hold this. Measure is fittingness, and the center must rule the circumference. Let oaths be bridges, rings be parts, metals be tests. Read images for the principles they carry. Atlantis isn't a map. It's a mirror you can use without leaving your bed. So the takeaway is simple. Plato's Atlantis is a teaching myth about measure and excess, built to train judgment, not a dossier for an ocean hunt. If you want the advanced, hands-on method to annotate any ancient mystery in minutes, watch the next video queued up now. Subscribe for more calm, text-first deep dives that help you sleep smarter. Let the playlist roll and drift.